How exciting. 4 p.m. on the last day of a conference. They're very excited. I see everyone is awake. Very good. I like that. I get energy. Hi, so my name is Aurimas, and I'm at Google. I work on AndroidX libraries, and I'm here to talk to you about taming the Monorepo beast and how we ended up scaling AndroidX library releases to be more bearable. It's our story of their journey, but it's not really a how-to guide, so take it what you will, the story that I tell you. Our process is still evolving, but I'm going to share kind of the state today and where we are. It's a 15-minute slot, but as you can imagine, we can talk for quite a bit of time. So this is a very brief version. So let's get started. So I want to tell you a little bit of what AndroidX is, so you kind of have a context. So it's a collection of widely used libraries that are open source and are targeted mainly to Android. It is the main Android API surface, and normally we kind of prefer you to use AndroidX instead of using platform APIs directly. And it has a very broad range of functionality. So it starts with something like Compose UI for building your UIs, but there's also room for database management. There's Camera X for building your camera UI and so on. So there's a lot of stuff there. And we are developed by dozens of teams. So it's kind of their disparate teams, separate teams that are working on all these things, and then they ship the libraries that we want. So we kind of have to go back in time to kind of see where we started. And where we started, we used to actually not be called AndroidX. We were called Android Support Library. And so I'm going to kind of like walk you through those days. And back then, what we did is we actually released monolithically a few times a year. So we would, kind of march one version at a time forward. And each major version was actually based on the Android API level that we were shipping from. So it was, 21 for Lollipop and so on. And every one of them was kind of like that. And it was kind of meant to be accompanying every version of Android OS that it was shipping. Eventually, we introduced alphas and betas because we realized the stability is quite important. And if you just ship the first library that nobody wants to adopt and everyone waits for 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, that's not great. So we kind of did that. But we then very, very quickly kind of realized that it's actually not really scaling as a process because we were releasing everything as a monolith. At that point, we had 60 libraries and like about 13 different teams working on it. And then our release instructions were 9 pages worth of a Google Doc, which can you imagine it's error prone, and we didn't really want that. And some of the libraries themselves were turning into monoliths themselves as we were kind of adding more and more stuff to it. So if you took it, you just got all of the stuff you didn't actually need. Additionally, if you wanted to release a bug fix release, you kind of have to re-release 59 other libraries that had no changes whatsoever because our versioning was all tied together into one thing. And we were also forced to release at the same time as Android platform. So, at the time we were working on something like a recycler view, which allows you to show stuff on a screen efficiently. If we're halfway through our release cycle, but the Android platform is ready to release, we had no choice but to ship. And so it was kind of forcing us into an unnatural release cycle. So in 2018, we decided we're going to do a kind of a reset of our system to kind of try to scale better. And that's where we created AndroidX. So what was the new plan? The new plan was to actually split up our libraries and kind of restructure them in a way that kind of makes sense. One of the things that we wanted to do is that you have a la carte adoption of the libraries. If you only need like a tiny little thing of the library, that's the only thing you pull in, and that's the only thing you get. And we also wanted to clear up our Maven artifact and the package contents. In the past, it didn't always match, and we essentially wanted to. So if you look at the Maven artifact ID, you're like, okay, this is what I'm going to get inside of it. So that was one of the things. And then another thing that we wanted to do that we didn't do before was to adopt library semantic versioning. And what I mean by it is that, major version was binary breaking. So essentially you don't want to kind of bump that ever. Minor version is new APIs. You're not breaking binary compatibility. And then patches, bug fix releases, and no API changes. So, it's very obvious to do today. Back in 2018, not everyone was doing that. And so we're kind of like braving into that and trying it out. And of course, there's alpha, beta, and RC. It allows us to do things like API iteration and then receiving feedback. One important thing that came to the semantic versioning that we wanted to achieve is we wanted to maximize the amount of flexibility that our library consumers have in terms of using of our libraries. And what we wanted to do by that is we always wanted to use the lowest version possible that satisfies all of your API requirements. So, if there's a library that depends on another library, in the past, we depended on everything on head. So if, you pulled in the version of 21.01 of Recycler View, you also got app compat the exact same version. And that was problematic because essentially, if you had a bug in one of the libraries and you wanted to upgrade another one for a different bug, you were stuck in this world where you couldn't upgrade to anything. And so to provide the maximum flexibility, we actually wanted to stay on the lowest version possible. And that lets users choose of like, do I want the version that it comes with, or do I upgrade to something newer? So we kind of kept that to make the developers' consumer lives a lot easier. So let's execute a plan. Let's try it out, see what happens. And very, very quickly, we learned that when you release libraries at different versions and every team is trying to do their own release schedule, it turns into a nightmare. And kind of to illustrate a point of why that is the case, this is a graph of Maven groups that depend on each other. And this is like a tiny little sliver, zoomed in version of the thing. And if you look at the two specific libraries, let's say there's Compose Foundation, which is like a library group, and then there's collections. These two libraries depend on each other, or one of them depends on the other. But these two are developed by two different teams, and they have different release schedules, and they might want to ship at a different time. And so if you want to release version of one and then the other, you have to coordinate between these two teams. And it's easy when you have two teams, easy. And it becomes way more tricky if you have 2, 3, 4 layers of dependencies, and that causes this nightmare cascading effect of like, if you want to coordinate, it's like herding the cats. If you ever try to do that, it doesn't work. And kind of the way this gets exaggerated is, if you have an API dependency, you can pick to a specific version of a library. But if you depend on something that's not yet been released, you depend on it as a head, essentially, at the project thing in Gradle. And that's where it turns into like this nightmare, co-located, locked by the hip scenario. So our thinking is like, can we move to some sort of self-service where the cost of overhead of like trying to coordinate all of these releases is less? And that's kind of what we wanted to do. We kind of wanted to move to a world of the optional release trains that is kind of controlled chaos. Like we give people opportunities to launch, and then they can choose if they want to participate. And to do that, we created a service that we call Jetpad, which is for releasing Jetpack libraries. AndroidX, Jetpack, same thing. Don't ask questions about it. So if you want to go and do a release, what you do is, as a library author, you go and say, like, actually, I want to pick my library and release it on a specific train. And you have these windows of every 2 weeks that you can just pick and release, and that allows people to coordinate. And what that means is you essentially get this dashboard saying, like, oh, I want to release, but your APIs have not been reviewed, right? And then we can do this type of enforcements of saying, like, you're going to a beta, your APIs have not been reviewed by API Council, which we have a group to make our APIs consistent across each other. And if you've not done that, you're not allowed to ship. And then essentially that makes it very clear and actionable what the library authors have to do instead of trying to coordinate and ask a person, like, am I ready to go? And similarly, if you have dependencies that you're depending on at head, it will also tell you about it, and it will let you coordinate to those teams to actually do the same release. The other thing to kind of make sure that it works well for us, we develop all of our work in like a single development branch. We call AndroidX main, and that's where all of the alpha and beta ship from. And one thing to note here, like even though things are alpha and beta, they actually ship to Google 3, which is our internal repository that is the basis of all of the Google apps that you have on your phone on Android. And at all times, that stability, functional stability is there. It's just the API stability is not present. And then finally, when we get to the RC and stable, we actually create release branches for those projects. And that allows us to get into the state where, nothing else is moving. And then we go into a cherry pick only mode. And that allows us to kind of iterate in a way that it doesn't disrupt that library release. All right, so how has it gone? Have we done a good job at this? In terms of code scale, I'm going to kind of share the trajectory. As you can see, we were growing in a pretty healthy rate even before any of this work. But it really took off once we had this set up. We just passed 2 million lines of non-commented, like significant code in Kotlin and 1.1 million in Java. In fact, we actually dropped in Java for the first time ever because we've started converting a lot of libraries to Kotlin. Cool. And then the other thing to look at is like the number of Gradle projects. This some people might call it modules, but essentially it's projects within our main monorepo. And that's been growing at a pretty steady rate. As you can imagine, for some projects, it really slows down as your build doesn't scale and your release process doesn't scale. But we have been able to do a pretty good job of just keeping it up and running. And this graph kind of shows the scale of our releases. It shows the number of Maven group releases we've done every half a year. And it's still, kind of up and running. And that means teams and library authors are able to release at a pretty frequent rate, and we're able to add more libraries. And kind of to give you perspective through all of this time of us, adding more code, adding more releases, adding more projects, we've pretty much stayed a stable size as a team. We have about 10 engineers, and has been the case for like 4 or 5 years. And we have 2 TPMs that help coordinate like missing gaps in the tooling that we have. So, I feel like it's pretty good. And then it's like, oh, mission accomplished, good job. Like everyone copy our model and then you're done. Sadly, it's not the case. We have some pain points. And some of the biggest pain points right now is that we have set up a system that discourages library authors to release bug fix releases. So instead, what usually folks do is they go and work on a fix. They land it in the main development branch, and the fix will only ship in the next release of the library. And that's problematic because, someone wants that bug fix early, but they don't actually want to inherit any other instability, potentially new bugs and stuff. They actually don't get it. And the reason it's the case is there's quite a lot of friction for you to be able to go and cherry pick that patch and put it in a release branch. So that's something that we really kind of want to investigate and figure out better. The other thing that's kind of hard is if you have to cherry pick any build infrastructure changes. So for example, we had a bug in our code where we actually not generating source jars correctly. As you can imagine, if you have 100 release branches, taking that and backporting it to a random state and time of your repository is not a fun experience, and I would not recommend it. So that's really painful. And then we really kind of want to have some better way of doing something like that. And then another thing that's really kind of painful is Kotlin multi-platform. As a product, it's really good. It's really amazing. But what we get into is we are moving away from the world, one Gradle project, one artifact, to a world of one Gradle project, a dozen of artifacts, depending on the number of libraries you support. And releasing becomes really complicated because all of these things have to ship as an atomic unit. And so our UI that was originally built of you have one library, you have one release, and you go, is really not scaled that well for Kotlin multi-platform. And that really caused, growing pains for us. Cool. So that's it. I hope you learned a little bit something about releasing libraries from a monorepo. And so thanks for listening to me.